New-Mexico-Territory, 1884. The morning sun stretched across the rugged mountains as 38-year-old Rancher Elias Carter rode his horse into a remote canyon. He had left his ranch before sunrise, hoping to bring home enough meat for the coming week. His rifle rested across his saddle, and the dry desert wind carried the smell of sagebrush through the valley. Elias had lived most of his life around these mountains and believed he knew every trail, every spring, and every dangerous ridge. But that morning, something felt different. The silence was unusually deep, broken only by his horse's steady footsteps against the rocky ground. After several hours, Elias spotted something unusual near a rocky ridge. An injured horse lay beside a patch of dry grass, breathing heavily. Elias immediately dismounted and approached carefully, scanning the surrounding canyon. A few yards away, beneath the shade of a twisted mesquite tree, he saw a woman. She appeared to be in her late 20s, wearing worn traditional Apache clothing, covered with dust from the journey. Her dark hair was loose around her shoulders, and one arm was wrapped tightly against her body. When Elias raised his rifle, the woman slowly lifted her hands. She did not reach for a weapon or attempt to run. "Please, don't hurt me," she said quietly. "I only want to find my people." Elias studied her face for several seconds. He had heard countless stories about Apache raids and had been taught from childhood to remain cautious around strangers in the territory. Yet the woman sitting before him did not look like a threat. She looked exhausted, frightened, and badly injured. Elias slowly lowered his rifle. He introduced himself and asked her name. After a moment of hesitation, she answered, "Naya." Elias noticed blood beneath the cloth around her arm. Without knowing exactly why, he decided to help her. He carefully offered his hand and told her that she would not be harmed. Naya hesitated before accepting his help. Elias helped her onto his horse and led the injured animal behind them. The journey back to his ranch took nearly 2 hours. Neither spoke much. Elias occasionally glanced toward Naya, wondering who she was and what had happened in the canyon. When they finally reached the ranch, he helped her down and brought her inside the small wooden house. Elias cleaned the wound on her arm with water and wrapped it with a fresh cloth. Naya watched silently, clearly surprised that the rancher who had found her was treating her injury instead of keeping her under guard. That evening, Elias prepared a simple meal and left a plate beside Naya. She ate slowly while watching him from across the room. Elias asked whether she had family nearby. Naya lowered her eyes before answering. She explained that several armed men had attacked her group while they were traveling through the mountains. During the confusion, she had become separated from her family. She had been trying to return to them when her horse was injured. Elias listened carefully, without interrupting. Her story did not sound like the stories he had heard around campfires. There was fear in her voice, but there was no hatred. The following morning, Naya was strong enough to stand. She walked outside and looked across the ranch. Elias's property consisted of a modest wooden house, a stable, several fenced acres, and a small herd of cattle. He had built everything himself after losing his parents years earlier. Naya noticed the isolation immediately. There were no nearby houses and no neighbors close enough to help quickly. She asked Elias whether anyone else lived there. He told her that he usually worked alone, occasionally receiving supplies from a small settlement several miles away. Naya became unusually serious. She asked him when he had last seen strangers near his property. Elias thought about it. 2 days earlier, he had discovered fresh tracks near the northern fence, but he had assumed they belonged to travelers. Naya immediately asked him to describe the tracks. Elias explained that there had been several horses, possibly 4 or 5, moving toward the mountains. Naya's expression changed. She stepped closer and quietly told him that the men who had attacked her group might have followed her trail. Elias felt a sudden chill despite the warm morning air. He reached for his rifle and walked toward the fence. From the porch, Naya watched him carefully, knowing something dangerous might already be approaching. Elias returned a few minutes later with a worried expression. Near the edge of his property, he had found fresh hoofprints pressed deeply into the soft earth. They were heading directly toward his ranch. Naya stood beside him and looked toward the distant mountains. "They are not only looking for me," she said quietly. "They are coming for your ranch." Elias stared at the empty horizon. Until that moment, he had believed helping Naya was simply an act of kindness. Now he understood that bringing her home might have placed a target on his own property. Somewhere beyond the mountains, someone was already coming. The next morning, Elias woke before sunrise and stepped outside with his rifle in hand. The ranch was strangely quiet. As he walked toward the northern fence, he noticed fresh horse tracks pressed deeply into the damp soil. There were several of them, and they were heading directly toward his property. Elias crouched beside the tracks, studying them carefully. Naya had been telling the truth. Someone had followed her, and those men were getting closer. When Elias returned to the house, Naya was already awake. One look at his face told her that he had discovered something. She quietly asked what he had found, and Elias explained that several riders were approaching. Naya lowered her eyes, knowing exactly what it meant. "You should let me go," she said. "If they find me here, they will believe you are helping me." Elias looked toward the mountains and then back at the injured woman. For years he had lived by one simple rule: protect his land, protect his cattle, and never trust anyone who could bring danger to his door. But that morning he realized another rule mattered more. A frightened person standing in front of him deserved a chance to survive. Elias packed food, water, ammunition, and a small medical bag. He saddled 2 horses and told Naya that he would take her to the mountains. She protested, warning him that the trail was dangerous and that the men might be watching the ranch. Elias simply replied that staying would be even more dangerous. Before leaving, he secured the stable and released several horses into a distant pasture to make the ranch appear occupied. Then he and Naya disappeared into a narrow trail behind the property. The path led toward an old mining route that Elias had not used in years. Rocks covered much of the trail, making it difficult for horses to move quickly. Naya knew the wilderness better than he expected. She pointed out hidden water sources, warned him about loose rocks, and recognized tracks that Elias would have missed. As they traveled deeper into the mountains, their conversations became longer. Elias learned that Naya had spent much of her life moving between seasonal camps with her family. She told him about her father, who had taught her to read the land by observing animal tracks, wind patterns, and changes in the sky. Elias, in return, told her about his parents and how they had built their ranch with almost nothing. He explained that his father had died when Elias was young and that he had promised to protect the land they had worked so hard to create. By afternoon, the two reached a narrow canyon surrounded by tall cliffs. Naya suddenly stopped her horse. She had heard something in the distance. Elias reached for his rifle, but Naya raised her hand and told him to wait. A moment later, several figures appeared between the rocks. Elias prepared himself for a fight, but Naya recognized them immediately. They were members of her family and friends who had been searching for her since the attack. An older man rode toward them, his face filled with relief when he saw Naya alive. She dismounted and ran toward him. Elias stayed behind, giving them space. For several minutes, he watched the reunion in silence. Naya's family looked at Elias cautiously, but Naya spoke to them and explained that he had treated her wound and protected her when he could have abandoned her. The older man finally approached Elias and offered a respectful nod. No long speech was necessary. The gesture was enough. Before Elias left, Naya walked toward him. The setting sun painted the canyon walls with golden light as she stood beside his horse. She looked at him and quietly said, "You captured me because you feared me. But you saved
Finally
me because
understood
you...
me.
Elias lowered his eyes for a moment. He knew she was right. When he had first found her, he had seen only an Apache woman in a dangerous territory. Now he saw a daughter, a sister, and a person who had simply been trying to survive. Naya thanked him for everything he had done. Elias told her that she owed him nothing. Then he turned his horse toward the ranch. Weeks passed. Elias returned to his ordinary life, but something inside him had changed. He no longer listened to every rumor about native people, or believed every frightening story told by travelers. He judged people by what they did, not by what others claimed about them. One clear morning, while Elias was repairing a fence, he noticed several riders approaching from the distance. He reached for his rifle out of habit, then stopped when he recognized Naya. She had returned with members of her family. They carried food, handmade goods, and supplies as a gesture of gratitude. Naya smiled when she saw him. Elias opened the ranch gate and welcomed them without fear. From that day forward, the ranch became a place where two worlds could meet without hatred. Elias had gone into the wilderness that morning looking for game, believing he would return with a deer. Instead, he returned with something far more valuable, a new understanding of courage, trust, and humanity. The woman he had once feared became one of the people who changed his life forever, and Elias never again looked at the mountains in quite the same way.